Coming up on this week's episode of Check Your Balances, we are joined by best-selling author J.L. Collins to talk about his new book, Pathfinders. Stick around, that's coming up next.
Check Your Balances is a show produced and owned by Craftwork Capital. The views expressed by the hosts and their guests are personal opinions and should not be considered personal financial advice or the opinion of Craftwork Capital. All investments have risk and may lose money. Consult with your financial advisor, tax preparer, or attorney prior to implementing anything discussed, and please do not use this show as the sole basis for financial decisions.
Welcome back to another week of Check Your Balances. I am Ross Anderson, joined as always by my friend and co-host Dan Maseka. And this week, a best-selling author joining us, J.L. Collins, the author of Pathfinders, which is just out, as well as The Simple Path to Wealth. Thank you so much, J.L., for joining the show.
Hey, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So you're known, I think, informally, but maybe you started this as the Godfather of Financial Independence. Is that a title that you started, or did people give that to you?
Yeah, so no, I didn't start it. And as a matter of fact, Christy Shen, who's a friend of mine, she's was a speaker at our Chautauquas and the author of Quit Like a Millionaire. She was the first one to start calling me that. And I confess, I cringed initially. I mean, I just... but I've grown to love it, and it's grown to be quite a nice marketing handle, and so I have an appreciation for it. I didn't have when I first heard it, but no, as arrogant as I may be, I wouldn't be arrogant enough to deem myself the Godfather of FI, but it's kind of caught on, and I've grown to appreciate it.
Well, the FI movement in general has caught on. There's so many flavors of financial independence these days, but it seems to be a growing focus among people who are financially minded. One thing I like about the Simple Path is it is simple as advertised. For those who aren't familiar, do you mind giving us the quick overview of what that path looks like? Because I think it can really be distilled into just a couple key points, which I love.
Yeah, I really can. I mean, it's basically avoid debt or get rid of it if you have it, live on less than you make and invest the difference. And then the Simple Path to Wealth goes into some detail on exactly how you ought to invest that difference. But the Cliff Note version of it is low-cost, broad-based stock index funds.
So one of the terms that you're known for is FU money. And I love that because there's a little bit of attitude to it. But can you take us through what FU money means to you and how empowering that is for somebody to feel like they have it?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, just like Godfather of FI, that's not original to me. I wish it were. I first came across it in, I want to say, the 1970s in a novel by James Covell called Noble House. And he has a character in there, and her goal is to have what she describes as FU money. I think for a lot of people, FU money and being financially independent are synonymous. But I prefer to look at it as the interim step before you're fully financially independent. At least it was for me. FU money is when you have just enough money to allow you to make bolder decisions about your life. And that can be surprisingly little. I mean, for me, it was $5,000 when in my 20s, I was debating on whether to quit a job or go backpack around Europe for a while. And I had the princely sum of $5,000, which was enough to spend a year in Europe in those days. And so that emboldened me to seek out a compromise with my employer. So that to me is FU money is that interim step between when you start and when you become fully financially independent. And of course, in that interim, the amount of FU money that you have grows. And so your fiscal strength grows along with it. So it's not an on-off switch to being financially independent. The moment you start, it's like going to the gym. The moment you start working out, you're a little bit stronger than you were the day before.
You talk a lot about freedom as something you buy when you invest. You're really just buying yourself freedom. Right. And I think of FU money as the opportunity for freedom because it might not lead to retirement necessarily, but it gives you the freedom to put yourself in better situations, take advantage of opportunities. that might not come around again. And that's what I think of when you tell your story of the Europe trip.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. It's all about freedom and allowing you to make those bolder choices. And as your FU money builds, the range of options you have available to you builds and increases. And so the caliber of life you're able to lead just gets better and better as time goes on. And the framing of it is buying your freedom was something that I newly came up with in the last maybe 5 years or so. Because most people, including me back in the day, thought, well, the money that I save and invest is money that I can't otherwise spend. But I've come to realize that that's not true. I'm just spending it on the thing that is most important to me, which is my freedom. Of all the things that money can buy, for me at least, buying my freedom is far and away the most desirable. And of course, you buy your freedom by buying assets that will then replace your need to trade your time and effort for money by building and providing money on its terms, working for you. I kind of muddled that a little bit. I hope it made sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. So I've heard you talk a lot about the primary fund that you generally recommend, which is the Vanguard Total Stock Market. And I think the ticker on the index fund version is VTSAX.
Correct.
That is the equivalent product to VTI in the ETF world, depending on how you buy it. Do you have a specific bias towards the fund versus the ETF? Does that matter to you?
No, it really doesn't. I own the fund because I'm an old guy. And when I started investing, ETFs were not a thing. There are differences between funds and ETFs, which we can get into if you really want to, but there are none that really matter for our long-term investment purposes. So I think a lot of younger people are a little more comfortable with ETFs. ETFs trade a little differently. It's a lower barrier to entry to get in. To buy VTSAX, I think these days you need $3,000, whereas you can buy the ETF, you can buy one share of the ETF, and that's maybe a couple $100. So there are those kinds of things, but essentially the portfolio is exactly the same. So you're getting exactly the same investment.
I will say that one thing I like, I tend to invest in ETFs more than index fund versions, but one thing that's really nice about the index fund is that it's easier to do automatic purchases. I found when setting that up with people. So if you're looking for the out of sight, out of mind, set up the guide path and just forget about it, right. The VTSAX might be better suited for you because you don't actually have to go in and do the clicking, which, the path of least resistance is sometimes the best one.
I didn't realize that because I've never owned an ETF. So I didn't realize you've taught me something, Daniel. So I appreciate it. I didn't know that, but I'm a big fan of automating things. So that is a strong reason then to stay with the fund version VTSAX.
Between Jack Bogle and Charles Schwab, would you put one in a higher place of who revolutionized finance more? Because I know that you're a Jack Bogle fan, and we are too.
Right.
But Charles Schwab removing the stockbroker essentially from the need for a retail investor to be able to buy or sell something is among the most revolutionary ideas we've had in terms of the use of the internet and what it's done for retail investors. I'm just curious, if you had to compare and contrast those two guys, how would you do it?
Well, I'm a huge Jack Bogle fan, and I don't mean to take anything away from Mr. Schwab, but to me, Jack Bogle is a fiscal saint. Because he was really the first guy who said, I'm gonna build a company and offer investments that are driven by what benefits the investor rather than what benefits the person selling it. Now, this is a reason, by the way, that Jack Bogle, I think he died with a net worth of maybe $300 million, which is certainly a lot of money. But when you look at the size of the company he created, and the success that he had in doing that, he should have been a multi-billionaire, as other people in the field became. The reason he wasn't is he basically returned that money to us investors with lower costs. So he was the first guy who said, spending all this money on commissions, buying and selling stocks is nuts, and it's a huge barrier to decent returns for the investor. Spending money to buy actively managed mutual funds is nuts. Those frequently carried a load. That's just another word for sales commission. And then they'd have very high expense ratios, ERs, 2-3% being common, huge drag on the investor's returns. The old joke goes, the broker going around pointing out all the yachts, belonging to his colleagues, and his friends saying, well, where are the customers' yachts? Well, Wall Street has always been, and still largely is, constructed to enrich the people who sell these products rather than the people who invest in it. And Jack Bogle turned that on its head. And by the way, met with huge resistance. Ned Johnson, who was the guy running Fidelity at the time, he ran a series of ads back in the 70s calling the whole concept of indexing and index funds un-American. And Jack Bogle had all of those ads framed and mounted in his office wall. But the industry did everything it possibly could to strangle the idea of indexing in its crib, because they recognized the threat to their enormous cash flow profits that were coming at the expense of us regular investors. But fortunately, Bogle persevered. Indexing has been well accepted. The research proves categorically that Bogle's contention that indexing would outperform active management is absolutely true. And here we are today, and the world is much easier and more profitable for average investors than it has ever been before. So thank you, Mr. Bogle. All due respect to Mr. Schwab, who certainly contributed in his own way to that.
Ross and I both used to be at the Motley Fool, and Jack Bogle was honored with a conference room at the office building. So we had the Bogle conference room that we'd go to and sit in oftentimes.
I always thought the Motley Fool was advocates of individual stocks. So I'm kind of surprised and pleased to hear that.
Yeah, they do a little bit of both, and yeah, we worked there. They have a little bit. I don't want to completely categorize the company because we don't speak for them, but just having been inside it, it's a little bit like Warren Buffett, that they basically say this is what most people do and should do is index. But oh, by the way, if you look at my portfolio, that's not what it is. And so that's a little bit of what's going on there. Is I think they are generally advocates for indexing, and then they run stock-based programs.
Well, for a long time, I was a stock picker myself, and I was familiar. I spent time on the Motley Fool back in the day when I was doing that. So, and I found it useful in that context. But indexing is simpler and more powerful. So I've moved on.
Undoubtedly true. I love the simplicity, and especially if you're getting started, being able to follow one simple thing that doesn't take a lot of thought is just so much easier. In your Pathfinders project, you've gotten stories from, I didn't count, it feels like hundreds of people that made its way into the book. And I wonder if in collecting those stories, you found people who, even though the path is simple, they just couldn't help but tinker from that point forward. And if you walked away with any really interesting tales that came your way and any lessons from reading all those accounts.
Yeah, so there are about 100 stories in Pathfinders, so your sense of it is spot on. And they range from just a few paragraphs to, 3-4 pages maybe. And they are very diverse. I haven't noticed any where the people are encouraging tinkering so much. And maybe it's because these are people who are following the simple path to wealth. Now, to be clear, there are a lot of stories where people are doing something other than just investing in VTSAX, but it's pretty simple. But to your tinkering point, more in my experience with my blog, I see that happen a lot because I wrote The Simple Path to Wealth for my daughter. And my daughter is wholly uninterested in investing, but she's smart and she recognizes that if she gets the investing part of her life right, her life is going to be much richer with much more options. But as she said to me one time, she said, "Dad, I just don't want to have to be thinking about this all the time." And that was an epiphany for me because I realized that people like me and frankly, Daniel Ross, people like you guys, we're the odd ones out. We're the ones who have a screw loose because we like doing this stuff. Most people don't. And so the beauty of the simple path and the reason I wrote it is for people, for my daughter specifically, and people like her. Now, because I write about financial things, part of my readership is those people. But part of it is, not surprisingly, people who love this stuff, like the three of us. And those are the ones who are forever saying to me, oh, yes, it's wonderful. I mean, the simple path is great. But, if you just added this little adjustment, and it's never ending.
I mean, we find that challenge all the time in terms of how we do this show, right? People write a lot of stuff with that intent. So we're huge Morgan Housel fans. I think his stuff is very digestible for people that don't love finance, but you still have to get them to read it, which is the tough part. And getting folks to consume that information, if it's not in their day-to-day love like it is for us, I think that's the toughest part, is how do you actually get them engaged and through that. Have you found any successful tactics other than spreading the good word one person at a time?
First of all, I'll join you in a shout out to Morgan Housel. I love his work, and I have his new book on my shelf. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I'm thoroughly expecting to enjoy it. Psychology and Money. I think in many ways, Psychology and Money and Simple Path to Wealth are a great combination for somebody starting on this. To answer your question, though, about ways to get people interested in this, I've never really spent much time doing that because there have been enough people who have come in my direction with that interest in mind. And the few times that I've come across people, usually because some friend is introducing them, who don't have that inherent interest, it's the old saw, you can lead a horse to water. And so it just doesn't seem to be a productive use of my time or there to try to persuade. So I've never tried really to persuade anyone other than my daughter. Now, having said all of that, one of the questions I got when Pathfinders first came out was, do you have to have read The Simple Path to Wealth first to benefit from Pathfinders? And my reaction was, no. I mean, you can read either one first. It doesn't matter. But on reflection, I've actually come to the conclusion that Pathfinders, for someone who's new to this whole concept, is probably the better book to start with than The Simple Path to Wealth, in the sense that if somebody's even a little bit intrigued with the idea of becoming financially independent and what that looks like and what the kind of people who are pursuing it look like, well, that's what Pathfinders is all about. And so it seems to me, if you read Pathfinders, you'll find out how doable this is. And I think you can't help but be impressed with the range of people and backgrounds who are in fact doing it. And, one of the pushbacks that I've gotten writing the blog is, oh, that all sounds great. If you're a highly educated engineer making a six-figure income. Well, that was never my experience when I met people in the community. And the community was much more diverse than that. And you see that in Pathfinders. So I think if someone wanted an introduction to this stuff and they picked up Pathfinders and it resonates with them, well, then The Simple Path to Wealth is really kind of the manual of the nuts and bolts on how to do it. And that's also, by the way, a great way to whistle in The Psychology of Money from Morgan Housel is, ways to think about this stuff. So that's kind of how I've come to think about it.
In picking up Pathfinders, I'd almost call it like an extended infomercial for financial freedom, because you get all the accounts. And I love that you put the city and state where people are from, because It makes it more relatable. It must have been an intentional choice, but seeing, oh, Arlington, Virginia, that's right down the road. Like we have the same quality of life and cost of living, and he's doing it. I can do it too. It was really cool. I like seeing that.
Well, and not just the states in the U.S., but their stories from all over the world. So I think what's inspirational to me is how humble some of the beginnings are for people who have pursued this. And And I think that resonates with me because the pushback I've heard over the years is, oh yeah, I mean, of course, I'd love to be financially independent, but I have to have these two luxury leased cars in my McMansion driveway, and I can't possibly give up those things. And you pick up Pathfinders and you read stories of a guy who started as a child migrant laborer picking asparagus. There's a story from a guy in Ukraine who's doing this. His country's being invaded. And so I think when you read those stories and then you hear people say, well, I can't do it because of my luxury cars. It's like, oh, okay. You're choosing not to do it. It's not that you can't do it. And that's okay if that's the choice you want to make.
It's all about trade-offs, and both the name of our show and how Dan and I both think about personal finance is intended to reflect that balance that you don't have to want to do it the same way we do, but let's understand what those decisions mean. And if you're choosing the Range Rover rather than the Honda Civic, that's okay, but you're gonna pay for that somewhere, and it might just be in the fact that you work 5 extra years or 10 extra years than everybody else around you because you've made that choice. And that, again, we're not here to judge that. I think that's hopefully a position that we take very clearly, is that's not right or wrong, but you do need to understand the impact of it.
Yeah, I'm fond of saying not every decision has to be a financial decision, but you should understand the financial implications of any decision you make. So using your Range Rover example, you can certainly choose to buy a Range Rover. I don't think anybody would argue that it's a good financial decision, but it doesn't have to be if that's what you want. But you should understand, to your point, the impact of that financial decision. Is it causing you maybe to work a few years longer? Which, by the way, is not an outlandish thing to say. It might sound that way to some people, but that when you really look at the numbers, especially for a luxury vehicle, the impact can be profound. So I think that I think most people don't really understand that. They don't think about it in those terms, right? And if all we accomplish is letting people understand that there is another way to deploy their money, there's another thing they can buy with their money, namely freedom, that here's the real cost of some of these more consumerist decisions you've been making, I think then they'll probably make a much more informed decision. They may still make the same decision, although I kind of doubt that if you really understand the ramifications of some of these decisions. But if you choose to, that's okay. Again, it's not my money. It's not my life.
So Simple Path was written 8 or so years ago, if I'm not mistaken. There's a whole new generation of people who today might be entering the world of independence for the first time, earning money, saving for the first time, who might feel like the world is such a different place. And there's so many things happening around them that make it impossible to step forward with housing largely unaffordable for a lot of people, wars breaking out everywhere, who might feel like the financial system is rigged. What would you say to people approaching investing with that mindset? Is there anything that you would do to get them over the edge and get them started if they have such a pessimistic outlook on the future?
It's the same mindset that I heard when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s. I remember my dad bought some stock at one point, and he bought it because somebody had given him a hot tip. And not surprisingly, it didn't turn out very well, and he lost money. And I remember him saying, the system's rigged. This is, it's just throwing your money away. And he never bought stock again. Well, as we talked about a moment ago with Jack Bogle, in a sense, in those days, with all the commissions and fees and things, the system was kind of rigged. But it's far better and far easier than it's ever been before. And even in those days, if you really understood it, it wasn't rigged. It was, people did successfully invest in the market because they took it a step or two further than my father to really understand how things work. That's what I try to do with Simple Path to Wealth, is explain to people how this works. Because the truth is, most people back then and today lose money investing in stocks. But that's not because the system's rigged or investing is the same as going to a casino. It's because they really don't understand how the game is played. And it's, I suppose, like any other game, if you don't understand how the game's played, you're probably not going to be very successful at it.
If you start off a stock tip, it's almost two bad outcomes. It can go up and you get lucky and you think that now you're really good at this and that's what you're going to do forever. And you pile all your money in and end up levering up or something. Or it goes down and you get out, you never invest again. And so that balanced approach of trying to introduce people to it with realistic expectations is so critical, because you can have two really up or down could both be bad outcomes if you're working off a single stock.
And Ross, that point about the up, the positive result can be a bad outcome is incredibly important, because sometimes you do get lucky, but people have a tendency to forget that it was luck, and they think, oh wow, I've got this figured out, and here we go, and that could be even more expensive. So yeah, that's a point very well taken.
Perhaps an unfair question, because you just released the book a couple months ago. Do you have another project in your future? Are you continuing to think about this stuff in a new way that you would present again, or do you feel like you're done for the moment?
Oh, well, so taking those in reverse order, I feel like I'm done for the moment.
Okay.
I don't think there is a different way I would approach things. I mean, I think The Simple Path to Wealth has stood the test of time. It came out in 2016. Sometimes I get asked, would you change things? The only thing that is outdated in it is when I talk about IRAs or 401ks. Obviously, the contribution limits are different today, and but those are all the little detail things. And I'm impressed how well the book has done internationally, where IRAs and 401ks, there may be equivalents in other countries, but they're not the same, and people are well able to see past that to the basic principles. And the basic principles are unchanged. And when I wrote the book, I was anticipating that those basic principles are going to be unchanged for decades. In fact, I think it's going to work as long as the United States remains a capitalist country and we continue to have a stock market that we're able to invest in, and that index funds are still an available tool. I don't see any of those things changing.
Yeah, I think the index fund is here to stay. That we can say safely.
Yeah.
Well, JL, we are very much fans of yours. We appreciate the work that you are doing on helping people see that this is doable, that it's possible, that it's simple decisions that you make every day. And we're grateful to you for that and for your time today and joining us.
Well, I appreciate that. That's very kind of you to say. And like I said at the beginning, I'm honored that you'd invite me, and I have enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely. And certainly check out the books. They're worthwhile. But if you want a easier intro into JL's work, you should check out his blog at jlcollinsnh.com. He's got a wealth of information there, and it's a great way to engage more with the concept and see things beyond what the book represents. So I encourage you to visit the site as well.
And we'll definitely link that in the show notes. For those of you that have questions for me and Dan for an upcoming episode, checkyourbalances@outlook.com is the email address for us. Thank you all so much for tuning in this week. We will catch you next time.